Welcome to Elias Boudinot, Volume 1, The Surprising Accomplishments of the Cherokee Benedict Arnold. For this series of Why It Matters, we are going to talk in a few overlapping spirals. We'll use chapters to help you find things of special interest and include sources in the show notes. We encourage you to look and learn for yourself. We did want to start this video with a brief content warning. I'm going to speak sometimes quite casually about a historical violent death, a specific historical violent death, and also talk about events that led to the death of many people, although more generally, and I won't really go into details. Also, honestly, if you delve into these sources yourself, I just want to warn you that you need to protect yourself mentally and emotionally, because these 18th and 19th century sources can be very dehumanizing towards basically everybody. So just take your time, give yourself breaks, try not to internalize some of the concepts that are presumed to be the truth for these eras. And let's go have a look at some sources. Okay, with that, deep breath. We're going to do a little matcha break and then get into the video. Oh, I hear you. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Lisa. Welcome to my library. And today I'm going to hopefully fell down some seams on my 1826 gown in progress and explain a little bit about the inspiration for this gown, who is a person actually called Elias Boudinot. And he was really, the best way to describe him is he was the Cherokee Benedict Arnold. So let's talk about it. Gosh, I'm just gonna sit here and talk to you guys then while she's doing this. So, okay, so I'm gonna start with the kind of oral history version of Elias Boudinot's story that I learned as a child, and then I will talk a little bit about my own research and experience and kind of having to think more heavily about his influence culturally and just as a person, as a Cherokee person. So bottom line, or so to start the story where it starts, when I was in fourth or fifth grade, as you can imagine, I was a little bit of a polymath and a really avid reader, as is still the case. One of the stereotypes about Cherokees is how much we just love books, and my family is no exception to that. I'm actually in my library where I have about, at last count, something in the range of 3,000 books, most of which I have read. The ones I haven't were my husband's that are a genre I'm not into, so I'll get to them eventually. Anyway, so when I was a kid, this would have been in fourth or fifth grade, there was a kind of extra credit thing you could do in English class where you listened to these audiobooks and then answered questions about what the content. And at one point, I remember becoming finally aware of this. It was something for some reason that had escaped my notice. And I had finished my work. And so I sat down and in a couple of afternoons, by my recollection, went through most of this audiobook library. And one of them, I believe, produced as part of a overall Oklahoma history piece, focused on specifically the death of Elias Boudinot. And being, as you might imagine, a very morbid child, I was fascinated by this story because I could be wrong. Please tell me if you can remember this too, if you grew up roughly in the same place and time. But I seem to recall them actually kind of verbally depicting the brutal execution or murder, depending on your attitude about it, of Elias. And I remember it being framed as he had broken Cherokee law by agreeing to sell Cherokee land, which he had technically done, or he had done. And but I recall the framing of it being kind of like, this is why we need to become a state of Oklahoma versus being Indian territory, because stuff like this happened where people just had extrajudicial executions or murders due to these, primitive laws that clearly didn't matter. And that's what I recall the framing being like. I wish I could find this piece of media because I could be making that up or overinterpreting it, but I remember kind of making it seem like the Cherokees who had done this were incorrect to do this. And so I recall going home to my mom and asking, hey, why did people murder, this journalist during Indian Territory days? And she explained it was because of our laws around signing treaties with the United States to sell land, and that he had signed the Njörðr Treaty, which at that point, even then, some of the specifics of it were still pretty intensely controversial among modern Cherokees. This was before the some of the Constitution discussions that we had in the late 90s, but I will say that modern Cherokee politics, in my opinion, still are heavily informed by this division between the Treaty Party and what was at the time during Elias's life known as the Ross Party, so the Chiefs Party. And my mom explained it was because he had signed the Treaty of Njörðr, and he was in fact wrong, and it was illegal for him to do so. And I didn't think about it again. It was like, oh, okay, this man betrayed his country. He knew he wasn't supposed to do that. He knew he wasn't actually appropriate person to sign the treaty. And I remember even asking, like, well, why would they take the treaty signatures when he wasn't chief and he wasn't, behind the chief's back? And the answer was, of course, that at that time during treaty periods, the Americans just worked with whoever would work with them. So it didn't really matter to the Americans who signed it, as long as somebody did. And there was a small group of men who did this, and most of them did not survive very long after the removal. They were not immediately executed. It happened in Indian Territory when people were trying to rebuild following the removal. So I just didn't think about it all forever. It was like, well, okay, he was a traitor. He did this thing. He knew it was wrong. And, that's the end of the story. And then it was actually a really long time. So this would have happened, I was in 5th grade in the early 90s. And so then in 2018, I get invited to go to a play on the arena stage in Washington, D.C. The play is called Sovereignty. And it's written by Mary Catherine Nagel. And some of my friends who tend to go to me with that kind of thing were like, hey, we heard about this thing. We should go. And we went. And I was expecting it to be focused very much on the modern issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which it was. But it included this really sensitive and what's the word? Sympathetic depiction of the Treaty Party, which honestly I had never seen anyone talk about them like that. And Elias Boudinot specifically and his widow specifically were depicted in this very moving, very interesting play set in the 1830s. And I remember being kind of upset about it. Like, I was a little mad. I was like, hey, you're giving people the wrong idea. That isn't, how this went down. He was wrong. The description I gave to my husband at the time was, well, it'd be like if, in 2000, after President Bush was elected and seated, if Al Gore had then gone to France the next, year and signed a treaty with France, like, that would so clearly be incorrect that nobody would even entertain such a thing. And to his credit, my husband, who of course did not know anything about this and had no dogs in this fight, was like, well, but um, there was a constitutional crisis, and you hadn't had elections, and if Elias's party could have won, they didn't have a way to win. And I was like, pardon? Like, I had never thought about it that way. And so again, Elias kind of went into the vault of my memories, and I just, it wasn't an important thing to think about. I had a couple of intense conversations with my spouse about, what did his life mean? Elias's life mean? What did Elias's stance on the removal and on cooperating with the Americans, reflect about Cherokee thinking at the time and his own experiences? And I left it there, and I just didn't think about it again. And honestly, I didn't really think about his accomplishments. To me, he was the guy who signed the Treaty of Njörðr, and he was chopped to death in a ditch, and that was correct. That was what needed to happen. And that was what I was told as a child. That is what I believed, heartily, fully, completely. And then the bizarre irony, the twist, if you will, is that I started trying to research the life of Polyback and the kind of context of Polyback. And again and again and again, this guy kept popping up in both primary and secondary sources. Elias was just inescapable. If you're trying to research Cherokees and Cherokee thinking and Cherokee primary sources in the 19th century, you just can't get away from Elias Boudinot. He was such an enormous figure up until the moment that he was killed. So there's the really short version of where I started with my thinking about Elias. And then basically this stack of books that I started looking into initially because I was looking to figure out what Cherokee women were wearing in the 1820s led to a really fascinating shift in my thinking about Elias's life, and a breadth in my thinking about Elias's context in a way that my upbringing did not prepare me for. He went from a one-dimensional kind of a villain and a traitor to still someone who committed treason but had much more in common with me than I had realized, and whose decisions and understanding of the world, understanding of America, was, I think, very astute and showed just a rare genius, really. And it's weird to still dislike and judge the decision he's remembered for, but be thankful to him for this whole other career and life leading up to that, which arguably is not separable from his final decision, his last major life decision, which was to sign the treaty. I will keep working on this gown, and I'm going to do a fitting tonight, and I will do some more scripted videos specifically about how my understanding of Elias has changed and why. And so I went from someone in 2018 who was almost offended to have Elias and the treaty party spoken of in a positive way, to someone who is making a gigantic orange dress so I can do a deep reading and assessment and discussion of one of Elias's most impactful speeches, which was a speech he gave in Philadelphia in May of 1826, so nearly exactly 200 years ago today, and in which he was fundraising for the opening of the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper, but also eloquently, intelligently, in a way that draws on the classical education of the time that he benefited from, describes Cherokee people and Cherokee culture in a way that is deliberate and helpful and provides a window into how at least some Cherokees saw themselves 200 years ago and sought to present themselves to the broader world. So, hope you guys are ready for some wild rides into the primary sources. Hey, did you know that my sister and I wrote a book about making 19th century clothes to portray our ancestor, Polly Beck? If you haven't read it, you probably should. You can get it anywhere books are sold, maybe, probably, at least on the internet. And I'll link in the description. Buy our book. We talk about how we figured out what we think our ancestor would have worn. We talk about how we made all this stuff. And we talk a lot about Cherokee cultural history from the 19th century, because she lived from 1820 to 1872. And her life and the time frame that she lived through was a time of massive, intense cultural change and debate among Cherokees. Debate is still not entirely settled, to be honest. And I made this dress because in my research about her, I kept coming up against this figure who I had always thought of as, this scoundrel. But his wife's shopping list from the 1820s was part of what helped us decide that our ancestors, by not this period, but by the 1830s, were definitely wearing the same stuff that American women were wearing, who had the same amount of money and resources. And this would have probably been a little more of it would have been a desirable gown to my ancestors living through the 1820s, but I can't promise you any of them had it. But I am in love with it, and it's very fun. So Elias Boudinot's wife bought some mantua maker shears in the 1820s. Her shopping list was preserved because she was a missionary, and that helped us figure out what we think that our ancestor Polly Beck was wearing in the 1830s through the 1870s. So you want to learn more about that? You want to see all the sources we figured out that with? You want to debate us about it? Read the book. Okay, I know this is a little hard to read, so I'm going to read it to you, and also the
link is below. This is from the Niles National Register, which was a paper published in Baltimore for quite a while in the 19th century. And their tagline is "The past, the present, for the future." Bottom line is, this is national news. This was the issue from August 17th, 1839. And it begins with the Cherokee Troubles. We have seen a letter hastily written from the Cherokee Nation, west of Arkansas, on the 24th of June. The information it gives is to be relied on, and is the first unquestionable intelligence that has come to hand. It confirms the report of the destruction of the two ridges and Boudinot, but gives no particulars of the immediate cause. From certain expressions in the letter, we should infer that their death was resolved upon in a general assembly, which Mr. Ross strove to curb but could not. For the writer speaks of the restraints attempted in vain to be imposed by the moderation of Mr. Ross. It goes on to a full description, almost hour by hour in some ways. And very interestingly, it does explain, while not necessarily who Mr. Ross, Mr. Ridge, and Elias Boudinot are, so maybe they presume that you would know this as a reader at the time, they do explain about the old settlers, who they call the Western Cherokees, that they were the people that removed themselves west many years since, and called the recently removed Cherokees the Eastern Cherokee. For modern people, that's confusing if you know anything about Cherokees, because we now have a separate government of Eastern Cherokees, but that's not who they're talking about. So just bear in mind that context. The annual report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs from 1838 and 1839 also covers this. Information of the excited condition of the Cherokees and of the horrible assassinations it has produced was received with the deepest regret. Farther advanced than their fellows of other tribes, placed upon a rich and valuable tract of country with large means and surrounded by all the elements of prosperity, the hope was cherished that their dissensions while east would be forgotten, that there would be a common effort for the common good. Disappointment has taken the place of benevolent expectation, which is bitter in proportion to the desperate extremes that have been resorted to. Instead of a temperate course shaped by reason, the arm of the strong has prostrated the weak, and the murders of leading and distinguished Cherokees have been perpetuated in the presence of their families, at their dwellings, or on the public road, and in one instance within the limits of the state of Arkansas. The first official intelligence of these distressing events was conveyed in a letter from Captain William Armstrong, acting superintendent of the Western Territory, dated 29 June, received on 27 July. A letter of a prior date from M. Stokes, Esquire, Cherokee agent to yourself, but received on 31st July with its enclosures, states that the murders of John Ridge, of Major John Ridge, his father, and of Elias Boudinot were immediately preceded by a general Cherokee council convened to compose the disquietude of the nation, and that they were severally destroyed on the 19th, 18th, and 20th of June last, in the order in which their names were given above. A communication from General Arbuckle at 26 June goes into detail on the subject of the Cherokee differences, mentions the murders as having occurred on the 22nd, which is the true date, and furnishes a correspondence between John Ross and himself on this subject, in which he invites Mr. Ross to Fort Gibson if he did not feel secure at home, expresses his apprehensions of a general conflict, proposes a meeting at the fort of the principal chiefs on both sides with a view to reconciliation.
So, I love that hairstyle. Okay, so you've probably never heard of this Elias Boudinot. Yet this villain, this traitor, he deeply influenced much of the formal nation building of the Cherokee Nation from 1825 to 1835, a fact that was invisible to me for a long time. He has lasting impacts on our citizenship and intellectual life, even if we prefer to focus on other leaders of the era. We have important religious materials in Cherokee that make sense in Cherokee, a bilingual newspaper, and an ongoing literary tradition, partly due to his work. So, as I hope you know, maybe you don't, in 1821, Sequoia developed a syllabary that allowed us to express ourselves readily in our own language. But Elias was a key part of debuting the use of movable type in that new writing system. In his work to support the leap of the Cherokee text from a handwritten language to movable type in less than a decade, Elias and his collaborators accelerated our cultural and literary development astronomically. Europeans had to wait 400 years to put ink to paper with a movable press. In only 7, we now had access to one of the most critical events in the history of mankind. This is footage from my 2024 visit to the Franklin Court Printing Office. It's a National Park Service site. And here I am holding a Cherokee Phoenix newspaper with an article by Chad Hunter about our press being repatriated to us in August of 2024. So this is ongoing history for us. So now for a brief summary, as I promised, of his public life and pre-treaty accomplishments. Elias Boudinot, the Cherokee, was born Buckwady in about 1803. His formal education and his name change both happened in Connecticut. So when he was a teenager, he moved to Connecticut from Indian Territory, from Cherokee Nation, which was an extremely long journey. On the way, he met Elias Boudinot, the Connecticut politician and philosopher, who is this guy, and was so impressed by him and was so Elias Boudinot, the Connecticut man, it just impressed young Buckwady so much that that's when he changed his name. That sounds a little extreme, but Cherokees at that time period did routinely change names for major life events. And as a Cherokee who has moved to Connecticut to go to school, it is a phenomenal change, even now, even in modern times, and it must have been even more at the time. And so he was formally educated in Connecticut. There's a whole separate set of interesting stories about that and how that school was founded and ran. And I will let those people tell that story because there's actually been a lot of ink spilled about that. It's very easy to find information about it. But one of the interesting things was we like to think of, especially, well, Connecticut, we can be very proud. Connecticut can be very proud of not being aggressively invested in chattel slavery, and Connecticut often sees itself and talks about itself as being very progressive about those kinds of issues and racial issues. And there's pluses and minuses to that as far as whether you believe that is the case, but I will get more into this in a later video. But basically, Elias's first marriage at the age of 23 was to a Connecticut woman, a white woman, and it was a pretty big deal. And I think the important element of this is there's a lot of discussion in 19th century historians where there's an assumption that Cherokee Nation and or Indian Territory later was very wild and lawless, and we were kind of bloody of tooth and claw, and that was true to a certain extent, but this wasn't limited to us, right? There was actually a duel to the death among a pair of Yale students in 1824 over the rumor that one of them had a grandpa who was a tailor, versus generations and generations of excessive wealth. So Yale isn't right next to Cornwall, which is where Elias was educated and fell in love and first got married, but it's not that far away. And so I want to be very clear that physical violence and up to duels to the death were in fact possible and had happened, and there was recent occurrences of it among men in his age. and social strata in Connecticut at that time. So it's important not to downplay the fact that while initially the young men of Cornwall had a meeting about his engagement, it did escalate to potential violence. So I want to be very clear about that. But the thing that really drew me to Elias, aside from him being inescapable, when you're looking at the Cherokee literature of the era, was honestly, I went to Philadelphia for a conference and I was reading this book, Cherokee Editor, The Writings of Elias Boudinot by Theodore Perdue. And I had, like I said, I had kind of avoided his work throughout my life because it just seemed like, I didn't want to dwell on, I felt like reading a book, reading his work as a Cherokee growing up felt like as transgressive to me as reading, a famous book by a German that was also written, that was written 100 years later, that translates to My Struggle. So I'll let you figure out what I'm talking about. But it felt kind of transgressive to read about his writing and to read his own words. And I'll admit, it was Theodore Perdue's scholarship, Theodore Perdue's commentary, because this is an annotated work, that opened my eyes to the sensitive richness of his work and honestly the true impact he had on us. His speech was given May 26, 1826 in Philadelphia, and it was a speech deeply informed by his formal 1820s education and, by necessity, the colonialist lens. It's tempting to assume he's being cynical in asking for financial help from devout churchgoers and abolitionists to improve and civilize his community, but I actually think he was sincere, partially because of his personal letters to family and the just everything else about his writing. I will say, though, and I'm going to do a reading of it, but I choose to read and understand this speech with the same indulgence that I extend to people like Booker T. Washington, Rachel Caroline Eaton, and others seeking to use the politics of respectability to show that we are people. 100 years later, it was still necessary to have a book called Indians Are People Too. This is 100 years before that, when conflict with Native people was much more fresh in the minds of everyone in the United States. And I think that's just really important context for him. Also, just all this stuff happened so fast and in the same period. So he got out of college in, I think, 1824 or 5, or I guess 4. He finished college in 24. He got married in 26 at the very end of it. Or the very beginning of 2026. Not 5 months later, he's giving this speech in Philadelphia. He's just moved his wife to Cherokee Nation and settled her there, and then immediately goes on this tour to raise money for the press. The first issue of the Phoenix was the next year, and he was instrumental in all of that. His early writing and editing work was just prolific and phenomenal. And this book by Theda really gives you all of those details. This is he also, another really important thing that I think we ignore a lot, even among people who are really into Cherokee history and Cherokee intellectual history around Christianity, is that and this book does a really good job at talking about the problems with this, which was The New Voice of God. It's a relatively new book by Margaret Bender and Thomas Belt. And I think this book kind of downplays Elias's participation in this, partly because, honestly, the sources probably do. White people who were his collaborators wanted to take credit for what he had done, partly because it made it seem more acceptable to the people who were paying the bills. They were missionaries. Their audience was missionary. It was missionary and missionary-minded churchgoers who wanted Cherokees to become Christians. When in 1826, when this work was really being undertaken, Elias was the deep minority among Cherokees, and that he was a convert to Christianity, and a sincere one, I believe. And but that was still the deep minority. And so one of the important elements was to get a Bible that was written in Cherokee and made sense in Cherokee, which is the hard part. So you can't just literally translate the words. Cherokee doesn't have words for virgin, king, wine, fishing with nets. We don't have words for those things in our language. Cherokee is a verb-driven language specialized to describe the world of the Appalachian Mountains and a matrilineal, matriarchal social structure. It would be difficult to find a language less suited to the physical environment and material culture assumed by the King James Bible, which is what they were using for source text. Some of the people who did early translations of the Bible into Cherokee literally went back to the Hebrew because the structure of Hebrew is more similar to Cherokee than the structure of English. English is a weird mongrel language, which I love deeply, clearly, looking around this room. But it's a weird mongrel language that assumes a certain environment that was not available or imaginable in Cherokee. I'm going to link to a copy of one of the first translations that Elias definitely worked on, and I just think it's a really interesting thing to contemplate is how do you translate Christianity and Cherokee? Well, Cherokee. How do you translate Christianity and a Middle Eastern Bible into a language that doesn't know what a virgin is? Into a language that doesn't care about kings? Into a language that focuses on and has different ways of talking about something if you saw it with your own eyeballs, or heard it from someone else, or believed it. We have different ways to talk about that in Cherokee. You can't just declare a statement. There's all this context built into the language that apparently that is hard. You have to make so many decisions about what you're telling the person, the perceived audience, in order to write in Cherokee, understandably. So I find that to be, the more I learn about that, the more I'm shocked by the accomplishment. And the more I'm kind of a little bit upset at how much people don't talk about the fact that it took a multilingual, Connecticut educated Cherokee to make that happen, to make an understandable text in our language. So with that, I'm going to try this version of this and see if it works the way we want it to. And I encourage you to read the whole text because it's a good, interesting text. But I'm just going to read a few of the most interesting portions to me. So, to those who are unacquainted with the manners, habits, and improvements of the Aborigines of this country, the term Indian is pregnant with ideas the most repelling and degrading. But such impressions, originating as they frequently do from infant prejudices, although they hold too true when applied to some, do great injustice to many of this race of beings. Some there are, perhaps even in this enlightened assembly, who at the bare sight of an Indian, or at the mention of the name, would throw back their imaginations to ancient times, the ravages of savage warfare, to the yells pronounced over the mingled bodies of women and children, thus creating an opinion inapplicable and highly injurious to those for whose temporal interest and eternal welfare I come to plead. What is an Indian? Is he not formed of the same materials with yourself? For one blood God created all the nations that dwell on the face of this earth. Though it be true that he is ignorant, that he is a heathen, that he is a savage, yet he is no more than all others have been under similar circumstances. 18 centuries ago, what were the inhabitants of Great Britain? You here behold an Indian. My kindred are Indians. My fathers sleeping in the wilderness grave. They too were Indians. But I am not as my fathers were. Broader means and nobler influences have fallen upon me. Yet I was not born as thousands are, in a stately dome and amid the congratulations of the great, for on a little hill, in a lonely cabin, overspread by the forest oak, I first drew my breath. And in a language unknown to learned and polished nations, I learnt to lisp my fond mother's name. In after days, I have had greater advantages than most of my race, and now stand before you delegated by my native country to seek her interest, to labor for her respectability, and by my public efforts, to assist in raising her to an equal standing with other nations of the earth. The Cherokee Nation lies within the chartered limits of the states of Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama. Its extent as defined by treaties is about 200 miles from length from east to west and about 120 in breadth. This country, which is supposed to contain about 10 million of acres, exhibits great varieties of surface, the most part being hilly and mountainous, affording soil of no value. The climate is temperate and healthy. The population of the Cherokee Nation increased from the year 1810 to that of 24, 2,000 exclusive of those who immigrated in 1818. We believe the number to be about 5,000. The rise of these people in their movement towards civilization may be traced as far back as their relinquishment of their towns, when game became incompetent to their support by reason of surrounding white population. They then betook themselves to the woods, commenced the opening of small clearings and the raising of stock. Still, however, following the chase, game has since become so scarce, little dependence for subsistence can be placed upon it. They have gradually, and I would almost say universally, forsaken their ancient employment. In fact, there is not a single family in the nation that can be said to subsist on the slender support which the wilderness would afford. The love and the practice of hunting are not now carried to a higher degree than among all frontier people, whether white or red. It cannot be doubted, however, that there are many who have commenced a life of agricultural labor from mere necessity, and if they could, would gladly resume their former course of living. But those are individual failings, not to be passed over. On the other hand, it cannot be doubted that the nation is improving, rapidly improving, in all those particulars which must finally constitute the inhabitants as industrious and intelligent people. At this time, there are 22,000 cattle, 7,600 horses, 46,000 swine, 2,500 sheep, 762 looms, 2,488 spinning wheels, 172 wagons, 2,943 plows, 10 sawmills, 31 grist mills, 62 blacksmith shops, 8 cotton machines, 18 schools, 18 ferries, and a number of public roads. In one district there were, last winter, upwards of 1,000 volumes of good books and 11 different periodical papers, both religious and political, which were taken and read by the population. Next page. There are 3 things of late occurrence which most certainly place the Cherokee Nation on a fair light and act as a powerful argument in favor of Indian improvement. First, the invention of letters. Second, the translation of the New Testament into Cherokee. And third, the organization of a government. Polygamy is abolished. Female chastity and honor are protected by law. The Sabbath is respected by the council during session. Mechanics are encouraged by law. The practice of putting aged persons to death for witchcraft is abolished. And murder has now become a governmental crime. From what I have said, you will form but a faint opinion of the true state and prospects of the Cherokees. You will, however, be convinced of 3 important truths. First, that the means which have been employed by the Christianization and civilization of this tribe have been greatly blessed. Second, that the increase of these means will meet with final success. And third, that it has now become necessary that efficient and more than ordinary means should be employed. Sensible of this last point and wishing to do something for themselves, the Cherokees have thought it advisable that there should be established a printing press and a seminary of respectable character, and for those purposes your aid and patronage are now solicited.
They wish the types, as expressed in their resolution, to be composed of both English letters and Cherokee characters. The most informed and judicious of our nations believe that such a press would go further to remove ignorance and her offspring superstition and prejudice than all other means. The adult part of the nation will probably grovel on in ignorance and die in ignorance, without any fair trial upon them, unless the proposed means are carried into effect. And I am inclined to think, after all that has been said of the Aborigines, after all that has been written in narratives, professedly to elucidate the leading traits of their character, that the public knows little of that character. To obtain a correct and complete knowledge of these people, there must exist a vehicle of Indian intelligence, altogether different from those which have heretofore been employed. Will not a paper published in an Indian country, under proper and judicious regulations, have the desired effect? She will become not a great, but a faithful ally of the United States. In times of peace, she will plead the common liberties of America. In times of war, her intrepid sons will sacrifice their lives in your defense. And because she will be useful to you in coming times, she asks you to assist her in her present struggles. She asks not for greatness. She seeks not wealth. She pleads only for assistance to become respectable as a nation, to enlighten and ennoble her sons, and to ornament her daughters with modesty and virtue. She pleads for this assistance, too, because on her destiny hangs that of many nations, if she completes her civilization. And may we hope that all our nations will. Then, indeed, true patriots will be encouraged in their efforts to make this world of the West one continuous abode of enlightened, free, and happy people. There are, with regard to the Cherokees and other tribes, two alternatives. They must either become civilized and happy, or sharing the fate of many kindred nations become extinct. If the general government continue its protection and the American people assist them in their humble efforts, they must rise. Yes, under such protection and with such assistance, the Indian must rise like the phoenix, after having wallowed for ages in ignorance and barbarity. There is in Indian history something very melancholy, and which seems to establish a mournful precedent for the future events of the few sons of the forest, now scattered over this vast continent. We have seen everywhere the poor Aborigines melt away before the white population. I merely speak of the fact, without at all referring to the cause. We have seen, I say, one family after another, one tribe after another, nation after nation pass away, until only a few solitary creatures are left to tell the story of extinction. Shall this precedent be followed? I ask you, shall red men live, or shall they be swept from the earth? With you and this public at large, the decision chiefly rests. Must they perish? Must they all, like the unfortunate Creeks, victims of the unchristian policy of certain persons, go down in sorrow to their grave? They hang upon your mercy as to a garment. Will you push them from you, or will you save them? Let humanity answer. These words come to us through 200 years, partly because of the availability of mobile press. These words, not just given in a good speech, but preserved, saved, able to still speak to us many generations later, when Elias's bones are dust, his children and their children dispersed through various nations, to appreciate his thoughts, his ideas, his patriotism, the patriotism of a great trader, the patriotism and intellect
of a man who, in trying to save us, doomed many of us. And yet his words are so touching. At 25 years old, he wrote this, put all 10 toes in the ground, said this in Philadelphia to an assembly of well-meaning, sympathetic, comfortable white Christian Americans, and begged for their help to avoid the fate that he had seen other tribes have. And his words still have a lot of relevance. Will we react to the pain of others with humanity? Will you push them from you? Or will you save them?
Thanks so much for joining us on part 1 of this series. And if you like this, please come back and like and subscribe. And if you didn't like it, I hope you find something else more fun to do with your day. And just to help you guys have a little moment of self-care, I'm going to give you a little bit of a matcha blooper.
You're such a good girl. I need to adjust the camera. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna adjust the camera and then you can come back here. Come with me. Oh, yes, girl. Oh, core strength. Hi.